5 people walked into Clapham Wood. 4 came back, and the one who didn't, a police constable on a routine patrol, was found 6 months later in a clearing that search teams had swept 3 times. No explanation was ever given. No inquiry was ever opened. The case was quietly closed, and the wood went back to being what it has always been: still, dark, and waiting. Clapham is a village in West Sussex that most people drive past without noticing. A handful of cottages, a Norman church, a pub that closes early. Unremarkable in every sense, except that behind the village, running along the foot of the South Downs, is a stretch of ancient woodland that has been associated with death, disappearance, and something that defies category for over 50 years. People have seen things in there that they cannot describe. Animals have entered and never returned. And at the tree line, in the accounts of multiple independent witnesses across multiple decades, something has been seen standing and watching, long-haired, hollow-eyed, wearing a grin that does not belong on anything living. This is the haunting of Clapham Wood, and I promise you, whatever you think this is, it is stranger than that. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Mara Cole drove into Clapham on a Tuesday afternoon in October, when the light was already failing and the hedgerows on either side of the lane had closed in close enough to brush the mirrors. She had been expecting something, some atmospheric signal, some quality of wrongness in the air that would tell her she had arrived somewhere that deserved its reputation. She found a post office, a pub with a chalkboard advertising a pie special, a Norman church sitting squat and grey behind a low flint wall, its graveyard backing so directly onto the tree line that the oldest headstones were half swallowed by roots. She checked into the only B&B in the village, dropped her bag, and went to work. The locals were polite in the way that people are polite when they have decided in advance to tell you nothing. The woman behind the post office counter smiled and said she hadn't really known the man in the photograph. The landlord of the pub said he was sorry for her loss, and that the police had been very thorough, and that he was sure everything would be resolved in time. A retired school teacher she found walking a terrier near the church said only that the wood had always had a funny reputation, and that she personally never went in past dark, then wished Mara a good evening and walked away at a pace that did not invite further questions. The police liaison assigned to her brother's case met her in the pub car park and gave her 11 minutes. The investigation was ongoing. No evidence of foul play had been established. The search had been extensive. He was sorry. He had somewhere to be. She drove to the car park at the wood's edge as the last of the light died. It was a small gravel rectangle hemmed by a wooden barrier, the kind of place dog walkers use on weekend mornings. Her brother's hire car had been found here 6 weeks ago, engine running, door unlocked, half a cup of coffee still warm in the cup holder. She stood in the exact spot and looked at the tree line and tried to feel something useful. What she felt instead was the particular silence of a place that is waiting for you to leave. Back at the B&B, she ate a sandwich she didn't taste and sat at the small desk by the window with her brother's file open in front of her. Outside, the high street was empty. A single lamp post threw a circle of yellow light onto the wet tarmac. She was reading when something made her look up. At the far end of the street, at the very edge of the lamp's reach, something was standing. Still, not moving, just present, in the way that a fact is present, not asking to be believed, simply being true. She was out of her chair and at the window latch in under 3 seconds. By the time she got it open, the street was empty. The lamp post hummed. The wood said nothing. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. She started with the oldest case because the oldest cases are where the pattern lives, before anyone has thought to obscure it. Peter Goldsmith, 34 years old, a police constable with the West Sussex force who entered Clapham Wood on the morning of March 14, 1972, as part of a routine check following a report of trespassing near the wood's northern boundary. He did not come out. His helmet was found on a path approximately 400 meters from the car park. His body was found 6 months later, in September, in a small clearing near the wood center, a clearing that had been searched on 3 separate occasions by 2 different teams, one of which had used dogs. The coroner recorded an open verdict. The file was never formally closed. Mara pinned Goldsmith's details to the corkboard she had propped against the wardrobe and moved to the next name. Leon Foster, 61, a retired school teacher who went walking in the wood on a Sunday morning in 1975 and was reported missing by his wife when he failed to return for lunch. Searchers found the wood empty. His body was discovered 11 days later in a depression in the ground that 2 separate search parties had walked directly over. He was lying on his back. His arms were at his sides. The first officer on the scene noted in his report, and then apparently thought better of noting, that the position of the body appeared deliberate. The Reverend Harry Snelling, 58, found in 1978 in an area that thermal imaging equipment had cleared 48 hours earlier. Same position, arms at the sides, hands open, palms facing upward. And then there was Jill Matthews, 26, reported missing in 1981 after failing to return from an evening walk. Her disappearance was initially logged not as a missing persons case, but as a voluntary absence, a categorization that delayed the search by 9 days. When they found her, she was in previously searched ground. Arms at the sides, palms up. Mara sat back and looked at the board. 4 people, for different decades of life. No known connection between them. Different ages, different backgrounds, different reasons for being in or near the wood. The police had looked for the thread that tied them together and found nothing. No shared acquaintance, no common history, no evidence of a third party. But the thread was there. It had been there the whole time, hiding in the details that investigators had noted and then apparently decided not to discuss. They were always found in cleared ground. Ground that had already been searched, ground that should have been empty, and they were always arranged, not fallen, not collapsed, arranged, with a care and deliberateness that suggested not accident, not exposure, not any mechanism that forensic science had a name for. Something had put them there. Something had wanted them to be found. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. The arrangement of the bodies was troubling enough. What the autopsy reports contained was something else entirely. Mara had filed the Freedom of Information request from her car on the second morning, not expecting much. Official documents in cases this old tended to arrive heavily redacted, if they arrived at all. What came back 2 days later was more complete than she had anticipated, and more disturbing than she had prepared for. The pathologist assigned to Leon Foster's case in 1975 had noted, in the formal report, that the body showed decomposition consistent with an extended period of exposure. Consistent with, and no further. It was only in his private correspondence, carbon copies of letters to a colleague at a Brighton hospital, included in the file apparently by administrative oversight, that the full picture emerged. Foster had been missing for 11 days. The state of his body, the pathologist wrote, was consistent with a minimum of 3 to 4 weeks of post-mortem exposure. He had no explanation for the discrepancy. He did not include it in the official record. The same anomaly appeared in the Reverend Snelling's case. Missing for 6 days. Decomposition suggesting 3 weeks minimum. The attending pathologist in that instance made a single annotation in the margin of her working notes, in handwriting that had the quality of something written quickly, almost involuntarily, before professional caution could intervene. The condition of the tissue suggests exposure to something we do not have a category for. That was all. No elaboration. No follow-up. The official report recorded decomposition as consistent with the known period of exposure, which was a statement so directly contradicted by her own private notes that Mara read it 3 times to make sure she hadn't misunderstood. She hadn't misunderstood. What this meant, taken at its plainest reading, was that the bodies had not been in the wood for the duration of their disappearance. They had been somewhere else, somewhere that operated by different rules, where time moved at a different rate, or where whatever passes for time had no recognizable relationship to the version measured by clocks and calendars. And then they had been returned, placed, arranged in cleared ground with their palms facing upward, in a posture that no natural process of death and decay could account for. Mara stood at the window of her B&B room and looked at the tree line at the end of the village and thought about what it would mean, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally and physically, for a human body to age 3 weeks in 11 days. She thought about where a person would have to be for that to happen to them. She thought about her brother, 6 weeks missing, and what the arithmetic of this place might already have done to him. She closed the file. She did not sleep. Outside, the wood waited, as it had always waited, with infinite and unhurried patience. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Her brother's notes were not organized in any way that suggested he had expected someone else to read them. They were written in 3 different notebooks, in 2 colors of ink, with sections crossed out and rewritten in the margins and pages flagged with torn strips of whatever had been to hand, receipts, bus tickets, a wrapper from a cereal bar. It took Mara the better part of a day to reconstruct the sequence of his thinking. When she did, it led her to a name: Charles Alderton, 79 years old, a retired archivist who had lived in the village his entire life and had spent the better part of 4 decades quietly documenting what he referred to, in the letters her brother had copied into his notes, as the Friends of Hecate. She found him in a cottage at the far end of the village, surrounded by filing cabinets and the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for someone to ask the right questions. He made tea without being asked and sat down across from her and folded his hands and said he had wondered when someone would come. The Friends of Hecate, as Alderton described them, were not a modern invention. The group had roots in the village going back to at least the early 1960s, though he believed the lineage was considerably older than that, a continuity of practice rather than of membership, passing from one generation to the next with the quiet persistence of something that had learned to stay hidden. They gathered in the wood during specific lunar cycles. What they did there, Alderton had never been able to establish with certainty. What he had established, over 40 years of careful and largely thankless documentation, was a pattern of proximity. Peter Goldsmith, in the weeks before his disappearance, had been seen twice in conversation with a man Alderton had identified as a senior member of the group. Leon Foster had attended what was described to neighbors as a local history talk, organized, Alderton had later discovered, by the same man. The Reverend Snelling had received a series of letters in the months before his death, the return address on which corresponded to a property owned by a known associate of the group. Mara's brother had found all of this, had found it, and had gone further. The last entry in his third notebook was a phone number, underlined twice, with a single word beside it: tonight. Cross-referencing the number against Alderton's documentation took her less than 10 minutes. It belonged to a current member of the Friends of Hecate. She pulled up her brother's call log on the phone records she had obtained through his network provider. His last outgoing communication was a voicemail 3 minutes and 40 seconds long, to that number, placed at 9:47 on the evening he disappeared. The voicemail had never been retrieved from the recipient's mailbox. It was still there, sitting in the system, unlistened to, waiting. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Alderton had given her one more thing before she left his cottage: a manila folder, soft with age, containing photocopies of documents he had spent years tracking down through ecclesiastical archives and county records offices. He had pressed it into her hands at the door without ceremony and said only that the Wood's history did not begin with the Friends of Hecate. It did not begin with anything human. The earliest material in the folder dated to the Roman occupation of Britain. Archaeological surveys conducted in the 1980s had identified the remains of 3 shrines at the Wood's periphery, predating the Christian era by several centuries. What made them unusual? Unusual enough that the archaeologists had noted it and then apparently declined to pursue it, was their orientation. Roman shrines were typically built to face a deity, to honor a presence. These 3 faced inward, toward the wood, and the objects found within them were not the standard votive offerings of Roman religious practice. They were older than Rome. Flint tools, carved bone, objects that belonged to a period of occupation so distant that the people who made them had no written language and left no name. The Romans, it appeared, had arrived at Clapham Wood, found something already resident, and built their shrines not as acts of devotion but of appeasement. They were not worshipping. They were apologizing for being there. The ecclesiastical records were more explicit. A document from the Diocese of Chichester, dated to the late 13th century, contained a transcript of testimony given by a monk who had passed through the village on his way to the coast. He had entered the wood at midday, he said, to take shelter from rain. He had become aware, within minutes, of a presence he could not locate but could not dismiss. And then he had seen her. His description, translated from the Latin by Alderton in careful pencil notes in the margin, was precise in the way that accounts given by frightened people often are. Precise because the mind, in extremis, records whether it wants to or not. A woman among the trees. Tall, long-haired. She did not walk, the monk wrote, but appeared, present in one place and then another with no interval of movement between. And her face, he said, was not a face but a mirror of the death within the one who looks. Mara read that line 3 times. She thought about what it meant to look at something and see your own death reflected back. She thought about whether that was a metaphor or a mechanism. She thought about the 4 bodies arranged in cleared ground with their palms facing upward, and about decomposition that outran time, and about a voicemail sitting unlistened to in a system that was still, technically, waiting for someone to press play. The wood had never been benign. She understood that now with a certainty that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the particular cold that had settled in her chest and did not seem to be leaving. It had simply been quiet, and quiet, in a place like this, was never the same thing as safe. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. 3 miles from the village, at the crest of a chalk ridge that looks out over the whole of the West Sussex Weald, stands Chanctonbury Ring, an Iron Age hill fort, occupied and abandoned long before recorded history had a language for either, its earthwork banks still visible beneath the grass after 2,000 years. In the 1760s, a local landowner planted a circle of beech trees along its summit, and it is those trees, ancient now themselves, twisted by exposure into shapes that suggest intention, that most people mean when they speak of the ring. From a distance it looks like a crown. From inside it feels like something else entirely. Mara drove up on the 4th morning and walked the perimeter before she spoke to anyone. She noted the way the wind dropped at the treeline, the way the birdsong, constant and unremarkable on the open hillside, stopped at a boundary so precise it might have been drawn with a ruler. She stood inside the ring of trees for 4 minutes and felt, with a steadiness that unnerved her more than alarm would have, that every point of the compass was occupied, that the watching was not coming from one direction but from all of them simultaneously, closing in from every angle at once. She drove back down and spent the afternoon with the witnesses Alderton had identified in his files. A woman in her 60s described stopping at the ring during a walking holiday in 1989 and losing the ability to move her legs for what she estimated as 6 or 7 minutes. Not pain, she said, not cramp, simply an absence of response, as though the signal between her brain and her body had been interrupted by something operating on the same frequency. A farmer who had worked land bordering the ring for 30 years said he had seen his dogs refuse to approach the summit on more occasions than he could count. Not bark, not shy away, refuse, planting themselves at a fixed point below the tree line and declining to move regardless of instruction, their eyes fixed on something he could never locate. And then there was the motorcyclist, 81 years old, still sharp, who had ridden up to the ring with 4 friends on a summer evening in 1966. He described what happened next with the flat precision of a man who has recounted something so many times that the emotion has been worn smooth, leaving only the facts. A force, he said. Not a wind, a force, emanating from the interior of the ring and hitting all 5 of them simultaneously, dropping them where they stood. And with it, a sound. He paused at this point in a way that suggested he was still, after nearly 60 years, searching for adequate language. Not a scream, he said finally. Not music. Not an animal. Not human. Something between all of those and none of them. A sound that had no business existing in a frequency the human ear could detect. He had never been able to unhear it. He said this without drama, as a simple statement of permanent fact. He had also, he added quietly as Mara stood to leave, never gone back. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. She found him through Alderton's files, a single index card with a name, a date, and the notation technical background, credible, reluctant. His name was Graham Hewitt. He had spent 30 years as a structural engineer before retiring to a village 8 miles from Clapham, and he agreed to speak to Mara with the air of a man who had been expecting the request for some time and had already decided, somewhere along the way, that he was tired of carrying it alone. He had been at Chanctonbury Ring on a clear night in October 1994. He had gone alone, he said, because he had heard accounts of unusual phenomena at the site and approached it the way he approached everything, as a problem with a solution, requiring only the correct instruments and sufficient patience. He had brought a compass, a notepad, and a torch. He had not brought any framework adequate to what he was about to see. The figure appeared at the far edge of the tree circle. Humanoid, he said, using the word with the deliberateness of someone who has chosen it carefully over a long period of time. Not human, humanoid. The distinction, he made clear, mattered. It was the right height, the right general proportion, but the quality of its presence in the space was wrong in a way that his vocabulary, he admitted, was not quite built to express. He watched it for approximately 4 seconds before it split. That was the word he used. Split. Not divided. Not separated. Split. The way a cell splits. The way light splits through a prism, cleanly and completely and with an absolute absence of transition. One figure became 2 identical figures, standing perhaps 3 meters apart, both perfectly still, both oriented toward him. He counted 11 seconds. He was precise about this because counting was what his mind defaulted to when it ran out of other tools. Then they merged. The same absence of transition. 2 figures and then, between one moment and the next, one. He was not frightened, he told Mara. This was the detail that stayed with her longest. He was offended. It had the quality, he said, of a demonstration, something being shown to him not because it needed to move that way, but because it wanted him to know that it could. A display of capability directed at a specific audience of one. Mara went back through Alderton's files that evening and found 3 other accounts she had initially passed over as peripheral. A woman in 1973, a pair of brothers in 1988, a retired teacher in 2004, all at the ring, all describing, in their own separate vocabularies, the same event. A figure that became 2 and then became 1 again, separated by decades, unknown to each other, no common language for what they had seen and yet arriving, independently, at the same impossible geometry. Whatever it was, it had been performing the same demonstration for at least 30 years. The question Mara couldn't shake was simple and had no answer she was prepared to accept. Why did it want to be understood? Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. She had not been looking for this. It found her the way the most unsettling discoveries always do, sideways, through a document she had pulled for an entirely different reason. A footnote that didn't belong in the file it was sitting in. A county planning report from 1974, filed in connection with a proposed footpath extension near the wood's northern boundary, contained a single appended note from a local councillor objecting to the extension on the grounds that the area had been subject to, in his words, repeated aerial disturbances that had not been adequately investigated by the relevant authorities. Mara pulled the thread and it kept coming. Between 1967 and 1977, the skies above Clapham Wood and the surrounding downs had been busy with something that nobody in an official capacity had ever satisfactorily explained. The sightings were consistent in their particulars across dozens of independent reports filed with the local police, the Civil Aviation Authority, and in several cases directly with the Ministry of Defense. Silent craft, described almost universally as boomerang-shaped, seen at low altitude moving slowly over the wood and the chalk ridge above it. No sound, no navigation lights, No flight path registered with any authority, present and then, with the same quality of wrongness that characterized everything connected to this place, simply not present. The peak of the sightings corresponded almost exactly with the peak of the disappearances. Mara mapped them against each other on the cockboard and stood back, and looked at what she had made and felt the particular discomfort of a pattern that refuses to resolve into anything her training had given her language for. She contacted a defense researcher she had used as a source on a previous story, a careful, precise man who chose his words the way a watchmaker chooses components. He confirmed, without enthusiasm, that the Ministry of Defense file on Clapham Wood had existed, had been classified, and had been partially released in 2009 under a declassification review. Partially, he repeated, with an emphasis that carried its own meaning. The released sections contained logs of the sightings and a series of internal memos discussing their origin. The conclusions were redacted. What remained visible was only the questions, which were extensive, and the frank admission in one memo that no conventional explanation had been established or was expected to be. He could not tell her what the classified sections contained. He could tell her, and did, that the file had been reviewed and reclassified twice since its partial release. Someone, at some level, was still paying attention. Mara sat with this for a long time. The wood had bodies that aged too fast and appeared in impossible places. It had an entity that split and merged and watched. It had occult performing ceremonies timed to lunar cycles at a site predating recorded history. And above all of it, for a decade, silent craft had moved through the night sky, leaving nothing behind but the accounts of people who had no reason to invent them. She was no longer certain these were different stories. She was becoming certain, in a way that frightened her more than any single fact, that they were one story told in different registers, and that somewhere in the wood, all those registers resolved into a single note. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. She went in at midnight, not because midnight held any particular significance in the rational framework she had spent her career constructing, but because her brother's final field notes gave coordinates and a time, and the time was midnight, and she had run out of reasons to wait. The wood at night was not dark in the way that darkness usually works, an absence of light that the eyes adjust to, that resolves gradually into shapes and distances. This was something more deliberate, a darkness with texture and weight, that pressed back when she moved through it and closed behind her like water. Her torch threw a circle of yellow light that seemed to stop at its own edge, as though the dark beyond it was a substance the light could not penetrate. She found the clearing in 40 minutes. Her brother's coordinates were exact. She stood at its edge for a long time before she entered. The clearing was perhaps 20 meters across, circular in a way that felt considered rather than natural, flawed with grass that was wrong in a way she registered physically before she could articulate it intellectually. Too still. No movement, no settling, no response to the slight wind that had been with her since the tree line. As though the clearing existed in a different atmosphere entirely. She found what her brother had found. She spent 11 minutes in the clearing. She did not photograph what she found there. She did not write it down. She made a decision, standing in that particular quality of dark with the wood pressing in from every side, that there are things the world is not improved by knowing, and that the obligation she had always felt toward the truth had a limit she had not previously located, and that she had just found it. She was back at the B&B before 4. She packed in 10 minutes and drove to London without stopping, through the dark and then through the grey and then through the pale, indifferent light of a motorway morning, and she did not once look in the rear-view mirror at the road behind her. The story she filed named the Friends of Hecate. It documented their ceremonies, their proximity to the disappeared, their decades of concealment. It was thorough and it was damning, and it was, in every particular that could be verified, accurate. It gave the world a human explanation for human deaths, and the world accepted it with the relief of something that has been waiting for permission to stop being afraid. The file was closed. The wood was declared safe. 3 journalists won minor awards for follow-up coverage. Months later, she stands at her apartment window in London and watches the rain move across the rooftops and holds her phone in both hands. The clip is 3 seconds long. She has watched it 200 times, looking at the static, at the noise, at the tree line barely visible at the edge of the frame. It was only in the last few viewings that she saw it. In the static, at the margin of the image where the light gives out and the dark begins. A face, long-haired, hollow-eyed, wearing a grin that does not belong on anything living. Still there, still watching, patient as it has always been patient, which is to say, without limit, without urgency, without any relationship to time that the living would recognize. She does not put the phone down. She does not look away. She is beginning to understand that it is waiting for her specifically, that it has been waiting since the car park on the first evening, since the high street, since the clearing, that what she saw in those 11 minutes was not a discovery but an invitation. And she is beginning to understand, which is the most frightening thing of all, that she is going to accept it. Thank you for listening. To help me continue sharing these accounts, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. It means a whole lot to me. Thank you.